Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our second installment of Serve's Fireside Chats. My name is Brendan Long, and I'm joined here as well by my colleague Nicola Fitzpatrick, and we'll be running you through tonight's session. I suppose briefly before we kick things off, just to let everyone know that this session is being recorded and the recording has just started now. So I want to give a special welcome to our contingent from Zambia tonight. We have Milimo here with us as well, who is working with our partners in Zambia, and I'm sure we'll hear from Milimo later in the session. Okay, so for tonight's session, we're going to be continuing the theme of climate action, and we're delighted to be joined by Ayanna Letcher. So thanks for joining us, Ayanna.
Thank you.
So just a brief little bit about Ayanna. So Ayanna is a passionate activist and student leader whose commitment to climate action is deeply rooted in both personal experience and academic focus. In July 2024, she volunteered with Serve in Cebu in the Philippines, working alongside the Presentation Sisters to support the indigenous Bajau community. Her role involved facilitating workshops on digital literacy, digital or environmental care and community well-being, aiming to empower a marginalised group often overlooked by mainstream development efforts. Following Ayanna's bachelor's degree in politics and sociology, she's gone on to pursue a master's in climate change, development and policy to support marginalised and vulnerable communities affected by climate change. Her academic journey is complemented by her active involvement in national NGOs and international development initiatives. Hope that all sounds good, Ayanna.
That sounds very good. Thank you for the compliments.
No problem at all. I suppose I know you have a piece of work prepared for us, but I suppose just before we start, it's great to hear great to hear a former Serve volunteer doing such great work. Could you just tell us a little bit more, I suppose, about your previous work with Serve then, and then the presentation sisters in Cebu?
So I volunteered in summer 24. So that kind of that progress was in the Philippines, of course, and we were kind of involved within the community, supporting them and doing community-led initiatives and kind of supporting community well-being, literacy, engaging in like games, play, the whole shebang, if you get me. So that was kind of what sparked my volunteer journey, which then led on to volunteering with other national NGOs like Student Volunteer Ireland, and then some delegate programs to then lead on to my dissertation, which I focused on international volunteering, to then get me here into my master's. So it's kind of been a long progress of developmental issues and trying to figure out where I best fit within.
Brilliant, yeah. I suppose just quickly, do you think it was that trip then that kind of sparked your interest in kind of climate advocacy and social justice, or do you think it kind of spawned in elsewhere?
No, I definitely think that was kind of the start of my journey, especially seeing how those who are less privileged than I are living and the joy that they bring and the initiatives that they encounter. For instance, they make water bottles into toys. They repurpose shoes, which things in the global north we wouldn't necessarily consider as an option. So it's interesting to see how they battle with the climate, especially as they're directly on the equator. Those areas are most affected by climate change. So it's important to recognize who's most affected and who has the power to aid them in a sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose you spoke there about kind of climate change and who's affected. I know you have a kind of a piece of work there ready to go for us. Do you want to just kind of maybe talk us through that, and we can take questions then from the audience at the end?
Yeah, sounds good. So I have a little bit of a presentation of some work I've done on COPs. So COPs in general are let me change my page. So a COP addresses climate change through reducing emissions and limiting global warming. So this is the main body of the UNFCCC, which is recognized as a central negotiation since 1995. So it operates on one member, one vote. So every country gets the same equal access. and it has consensus-based decision making. So if someone doesn't agree with a decision, it won't go through. That has its benefits and its cons, which I'll go into later. So is it a success? So here in this graph, we see that climate change and temperature has actually risen since the start. So there has been 30 plus COPs, but only two have been deemed a success. And this is the International Negotiation Forum with over 80,000 attending 1 year in Dubai. So the first success was Kyoto, which solved the stratospheric ozone, and then the Paris Agreement, which we all know that led on to the Sustainable Development Goals, which CERV implements, and that is to keep temperatures below 1.5, and then a load of stream of development initiatives have come off of that. Yet, as we see from the graph, the emissions have doubled, and if not, been more than historical emissions to date. So, who's influencing this and why? So, COPs are influenced by fossil fuels. So, fossil fuels is what they have contributed to two-thirds of greenhouse gas emissions. So, they get into the COPs, they lobby, they support developing countries that don't have the supplies themselves. So, they'll go onto their delegation and they'll try to dilute their ambitions and say, you need fossil fuels to kind of gain economic development. So they apply that tactic, delay outcomes and delay emission reductions. So this is all funded through like the governments and through schemes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have big tech on the other side. So big tech is in control of all our media, which we see. We've seen this example from Donald Trump, where X promoted his schemes, Elon Musk promoted his schemes, and we can see that since then, USA has left the Paris Agreement, has dropped every notion of climate change from federal like accounts, has completely swiped the whole idea of it being an issue. So they spread the narrative and delay climate change. Additionally, they have political donations. So I think almost every single big multi-corporation in the US related to big tech funded $1 million to Donald Trump's initiatives. In particular, Elon Musk funded 227 million, plus having a huge influence on his X platform promoting Trump, which, as I've mentioned, he completely dropped everything to do with climate. So we can see this connection throughout, which we as the typical people can't see for face value. So, if we take the example of Bill Gates and Peter Singer, so Bill Gates excuse, is he Microsoft, I think? Um, Something along them lines. And then Peter Singer is a national advocate from Australia. So before COP30, Bill Gates said the tough truths about climate change and that it won't affect civilization, it's not a risk, and we should prioritize other issues, and that global tax won't work. And he's like, AI will solve the issue. Peter Singer, an alternative delegate, said he's overlooked huge issues and minimized feedback loops. So as the climate rises, so does the issues among it. So permafrost melts, ice thaws, sinks turn into sources, all of which then emit more CO2, which dramatizes climate change. And it's extremely detrimental to human welfare, which Bill Gates refused to mention. So climate denial. So as we see from this graph here, there's different discourses. So there's surrender, redirect responsibility, push for non-transformative solutions, and emphasize the downsides sizes. So as we've seen from Bill Gates, he's redirected the responsibilities by noting the impossibility of carbon tax. Despite this, Oxfam has stated the main way to get through climate change and solve it through financial aid is through taxing the rich, which he said completely directed that responsibility. Additionally, he pushed for non-transformation solutions. So instead of reducing emissions, he's saying that AI is going to be able to solve it, despite AI using a huge amount of energy. Additionally, he emphasized that it would take away from funding needed in different humanitarian sectors. This overall has sufficiently reduced ambition for climate change action. Additionally, hearing this from an influential actor weakens public opinion on it. So, when we consider less developed countries and developing nations, in this graph here, we see that developed and developing emit the same amount of CO2. But when we consider that 84% of the population is in developed regions, we see that, and LDCs have a smaller contribution of population. We see that LDCs in particular have contributed the least amount per capita, 40% lower than developed nations. So when we consider this graph down here, we can see that developed are a huge issue as to why climate change is so dramatic right now. So adaptation has been consistently subordinate to mitigation. So adaptation, in a sense, is kind of how to work along climate change because they don't have the funding necessarily, like the global north, to implement these huge technical solutions. So, therefore, the UNFCCC is ingrained in biases, which normalizes the developed countries' needs. So, as we see, mitigation is a huge thing for the developed countries, but not for the developing. So, this leads to the developed countries' objective, scientific understanding, legal expertise, imperfect, and not being held to the same standard. This means it's inaccessible for them to have meaningful participation. So a little bit on the differences between mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation, like I said, led by the global north, they have the money, they have the finances, the infrastructure. They're not necessarily worried about climate change the same way the global south is because they're not affected given where they're based in the world. So it attracts private finance, as we've seen from solar panels and renewable energies and electric vehicles. Many of these corporations are taking advantage of the financial gain they can make and limiting it through IP, which is intellectual property rights. So limiting the access for developed nations. So again, it has strong technical progress. So there's a lot it can scale up quite quickly in comparison to adaptation, which is affected more vulnerable global south community. It's underfunded, has low financial returns, and is limited in technology. So adaptation is typically a local issue, so there's not as much transferability when it's applied. So here we see how climate change was financed in 2023. So here in this box on the bottom is mitigation. So that's what I mentioned earlier, like renewable energies, wind, solar, electric vehicles. That was funded 1,700 billion, aka trillion. And then adaptation, which was given to the global south, the developing nations, was 65. So we can see a huge stark comparison on where they prioritize their funding. So climate financing in general. So over 90% was provided as debt and equity. So as we see, the people who are affected by climate change the most are in the global south, which are additionally the most vulnerable to climate change, to finances, to everything you can think of. They're essentially shaped by market profitability rather than climate vulnerability. So it's structuring it around who can profit and why, not considering who's more affected. So here we see the adaptation needs. So this, again, like I've said, is for the developing countries. And with considering how much money we're giving to the developed, already not as vulnerable, this needs to go up dramatically by 365 billion, 12 to 14 times as much as we have at the moment. So it's highlighting the limited success of adaptation at COPs. So essentially limiting for the developing nations to make a meaningful contribution, because as we see, their funding is being demised and they're not going to be able to access what they need because as climate change rises, I think it's also for every $1 invested into adaptation, $14 is saved in damages. So as we can see, without this adaptation, they're losing money in a sense. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. It was just a little quick summary of what I've learned so far. It's basically just explaining the comparison between developed and developing nations and who's prioritized within the schemes and the systematic bias behind it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ayanna. God, you're a little star. Like, wow, 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 wow. I'm going to open to the floor first to see, does anybody want to make any comments right now? Or will we go to questions? I have a million questions for you, 5 million actually, but I won't be able to ask them all now. So it's probably better to offer them to the floor first. Milmo, do you guys have anything? Do you want to add anything? Oh, he's on mute. Um,
Uh, so far, I'm okay, but
yeah,
I think my the people on the call would love to say anything.
yeah.
Cladwin and Chikumbi, maybe you have anything to contribute towards the presentation. We are free to contribute.
Yeah, yeah. And very welcome to them too. Thank you so much for coming on. Um, so I suppose I have just researched it a little bit this week, and there it's like lots of big words, really, isn't it? Like adaptation, mitigation, like it cops even what it stands for. The fact that it's just really what it is a big, huge meeting of many concerned people to discuss this issue. So that it like when you kind of simplify it down a bit, it kind of makes it a little bit easier to kind of grasp. And I suppose as well, like what I found as well with it, just not with jargon, but when you're talking about it, we talk about these big issues all the time, probably in our conversations and in our workplace as well. But like it's actually quite uh, when it comes into these big words, you kind of get a bit blindsided by them just a little bit. So like I was all week I'd said to Brendan, we'll have some questions ready, but I have to go off and study this. Like I just feel like what Ayanna's going to deliver, I'm going to go, oh my god! But like it's actually you're amazing, and like the work that you're doing. Especially, I was on that trip with you, and you went to the Philippines. And when you think back to like those 2 years ago, and like what you've done in that short amount of time is just fantastic. And you haven't lost like you haven't become miserable in this area of policy and talking about policy, which actually can be quite disheartening. So, like, I suppose my questions are all around like I have a few different ones, but I'm trying to think what's the easiest one to kind of ask you first, like so like say like what should communities or NGOs like serve ask governments to measure, like if we had a voice, like what should we be asking them to measure?
Yeah, so I've actually just done a consultancy program with a UK-based charity who's trying to reduce their emissions. So they support migrant workers coming over and getting work, but then they also have to consider the flight mitigation, the flight fuels in between.
Yeah.
So the how like us as individuals can reduce our emissions, it boils down to what am I doing right now and how can I change that? So, for instance, considering what you're using at home is a huge valuable source, what energy you're using. Additionally, like I said, who you're supporting on the media. So, what apps you're using in particular, I think X has been quite detrimental at the moment. And I think it's
Mm,
important to recognize that when you're using these platforms, you're also giving them the power. So it's important to recognize who you want to support and who you don't.
yeah.
Additionally, there's other tactics such as applying for carbon offsetting. So there's land-based solutions and technical-based solutions, both of which require an immense amount of research, um, and are a little bit too complex for someone who isn't an expert in the field.
Mm,
And you also need to be careful because 90% of these carbon credits that have been sold have been invalid and overused and have not actually resulted in any reduction of emissions. So it's
mm,
just really important that we don't try, like Gates said, hope that AI will solve it because the issue is stopping what we're doing now and not going to the extreme. The
mm,
society we live in, I think it has quite an overconsumption but based mindset, and
mm.
limiting that has a unutilized potential, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, and it's interesting as well because, like, when you think about who this affects the most, and, I had like in what I read up during the week, just how their voice is being heard, like so how Indigenous tribes are being heard or not heard at these. There was one of the COPs throughout the past 4 years where there was like it's kind of badges and an invite that you get to these things, but that there was one person in allowed in, but without a translator to to represent their group. And I kind of feel that like there's possibly a little bit when you go into the deepness of what they are made up of, who's listening to it, who's delivering it out, and then you add in what you're talking about, which is where is the money going, like North and Global South, like where is the money going and what are the solutions and who's coming up with the solutions, because the people there are only going to be able to speak for the solutions that they see as possible for what they see as the problem. Where if we're not really, like I know the last one was held in the Amazon, which was a token kind of to go to where it's one of the parts of the world that can be utilized the best to mitigate and for adaptation for carbon emissions. And it's one where there's the most loss. Yeah, but that so it was brought there. But I kind of almost feel looking at that, what difference has that actually made to carbon emissions? So it's kind of what happens afterwards, after these amazing protocols are delivered, or these amazing promises, or these amazing discussions, and they're like, whilst they're messy, they're actually necessary. So whilst I'm saying what I'm saying, I also do believe that they are necessary because they are the only point in the world where everybody is meeting. It's the only place where all countries are meeting on this. But like it's almost an impossibility, really, isn't it? When you look at how grand of scale it is, but also like how does it affect people locally? So like we have partners here from Zambia, like what are they doing in, like what's happening in your area for mitigation or adaptation, and where is that funding coming from? Like if you break it down into all tiny spaces in the world, how do we get to that space? It's just it's so large, it's so incredibly big, and so it's quite overwhelming to kind of to think of this topic that you're speaking about tonight. And like I know, one of the things, it's for me, I could probably go down the negative route of it much easier. And this is why I was saying to Brendan, you need to come up with questions, because I will automatically go to the critical side of this. Like immediately we'll go to it because it's just too close to my heart here that, when we look at who suffers and where is the money and why is that money not even just being half shared across, to really actually try and solve this problem. So I am going to ask Brendan to ask some questions that's a little bit probably more positive and more upbeat than mine. But I'm happy to have the hard talk too.
Yeah, I suppose on a slightly lighter note, you made an interesting point there, Ayanna, about maybe being that bit more careful about who you support, even on a smaller level. So I suppose, like as a student yourself, and I suppose as a student myself as well, where do you think, maybe as younger people, where do you think we can kind of have a positive impact, whether it be just kind of day-to-day changes or long-term ones?
Yeah, so I feel like it's difficult to be able to put into perspective how one person can make a difference. But additionally, if you genuinely try and make that impact, it's not going to go astray. So, for example, initiatives I undertaken is if I see a bit of rubbish on the floor, I'm picking it up instead of getting a taxi, I'm walking or getting the bus. I think it's like all these meaningful things that emit emissions and contribute to waste is something I'll try and have a second thought about if it's not necessary. Additionally, as a student, I do think it's so important to get involved in green-based initiatives. Pre-working a full-time job, which your time has just been absolutely taken out of your hands, I think it's really important to kind of get a grasp as to what kind of schemes you'd want to support while you still have the time to do so. So, like I've said, working with Serve in the past has been really beneficial to kind of frame my global mindset. And then as well, schemes and societies through my university as well.
Brilliant, yeah. I suppose as a former volunteer, then maybe as well, and I know you, you've studied this extensively. What gaps then do you see, I suppose, between maybe climate policy then and then what's kind of actually happening on the ground?
Yeah, so I mean, as we've seen from the Paris Agreement, it claimed it was going to limit emissions by 2 degrees. But considering everyone's global ambitions and the national determined contributions, it's predicted to be from 2.4 to 2.8 degrees, rising that we'll see, I think, until 2030. So there is a big gap in policy at the moment. I think we can kind of view COPs as nearly a vision board of what we want to achieve rather than what will actually be achieved in a sense.
Mm.
Um, and as well, I think with when we're speaking about climate policy, it's different for a singular country to exert that control over their population when we don't have carbon tags, when we don't have anything kind of pushing them towards the alternative solution, when we don't have enough initiatives that support the transfer towards renewable energies. Um, but I don't think it's necessarily just to blame on, let's just say, the governments who are creating these policies. It's really difficult to exert this control over a huge global issue. But I think it's important for there to be more steps made from governments to influence their citizens and their companies that work within to kind of make this difference.
Mm.
Yeah, excellent. Would anyone in the audience have any more questions? Maybe not even just regarding the presentation there, but just maybe anything at all for Ayanna to answer there.
There was like silence is golden.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I was reading something about the taxes, about the states. There's this guy from Norway, really good speaker, about back in the 50s, there was a higher rate of tax that people paid, and it actually led to a better kind of economy and better situation worldwide. I do wonder about this concept of carbon taxes, like what it would look like, what it would actually really be, how much it would be, and how you would grade that out. So he was talking about having a 91% tax rate on billionaires, like on rich people. And it was just like this uproar in the audience about it. And I was kind of thinking like we literally have the money in the world to solve this. And like you say, is one of your first comments at the very beginning, like was if we just stop doing what we're doing at the moment, like literally if we just stopped like the overproduction of plastic, the overproduction of, processed food, they bring back farming, really kind of dig back into these almost easy things to do, the mend, the repair and the repair idea, repair your bicycle, repair your clothes instead of the constant buying from overseas. Like it is a really kind of it's almost simple in the way that it's at the same time so complicated. It's like and so complex that like if we just did those things, we could actually make these drastically huge changes. So
Mhm.
it's kind of I think for people in a very like locally what you can do yourself, it is still back down to that, that what can you do yourself that can make a big difference. And it does come into those spaces again. And then you're also at the same time having that big conversation about making people more responsible that have more money, that they can actually, help others. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, Ayanna. Like it really is, and even like when we would have been on the trip, we would have talked about it. I mean, you see the inequalities so strong, and you're trying to understand it really, and understand what difference can you make yourself to help repair the climate damage that we actually have created, by our behaviors over the past couple of years, many years. But yeah, it's so interesting. But like, does anybody have any? I know people are sitting in cars and stuff like that. So, is there anybody there has any questions or any comments on the topic, or that they would like to say anything at all to us?
Yes. Hello. I'm joining in there late, but
Hey, Jack.
it was great to hear it all there, Ayanna. Well done. You serious amount of work put in, and I know you've done a lot of research yourself. But I think just to add to what you were saying, Nicola, there about our own input into it, it's neoliberal model that we're living in at the moment. So I think if small adjustments, even on in our side of things in the world, where you're not buying the latest trends of clothes and phones and all that crack. Like you can really do a lot of good by just upscale, like refurbishing and upcycling, I suppose. I feel like that's quite a good step to take to work towards the right direction, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think on that point, like you said, it is like the liberalist society that we're living in, and a lot of it is also out of our control. I do have a lot of friends from different parts of the world, like Colombia and South Africa, and all of which are studying climate change with me at the moment, and they said the the plastic is you can't help but buy the plastic. They've said they've never gone through so much plastic in their life because it's just completely ingrained into our society, which like isn't as removable as we would hope it to be. But it's then just kind of like considering the alternatives to that then as I think there's been protests here in Brighton, where I live at the moment, where everyone's leaving their plastic rubbish at the supermarkets, getting supermarkets to reconsider what waste they're implementing when they finally have to deal with it themselves.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful action, isn't it? That type of protest. They did that a few years ago as well in the Lidls across the country, in here in Ireland, and it did work well because they kind of reduced down a lot of their packaging because of that, and they had way more cardboard packaging, which is kind of easier to recycle. So it is. They still have plastic, but that's a powerful protest. So I do think that's really important. Um, and thanks, Jack. You're so good. Thank you. Lady, do you have a question? You have your hand up. I see it on my screen.
Yep, yep. Hello. Hello, everybody.
Hey.
Just I wanted to say that I'm agree with the topic that we have to search more ways to cure the environment, but at the same time, I think that in some countries, like my country, I'm from Colombia, and in another countries, we have to face this kind of problems that we don't develop by the time, at least knowing the same level that the others. And a lot of times these kind of countries have to face the big responsibilities without being involved with the big causes. Then at the end, our environment, our landscapes have to, but that people pay for the carbon bonus in other countries, but we have to support the consequence. Then how is the question is how we can make bigger steps in this, in this situation, because we can save our plastic at home, we can divide the beans and all these kind of small steps. But at the end, the big companies don't want to change a lot of things. Then if the governments and the companies don't make a real change in their responsibilities, I feel sometimes that our steps are so small that we have to continue for sure. But sometimes I think that are too small in that way, and we can change a lot because the power is focused in only some groups in the world. That is the situation that we are living today, that how all the power and the geopolitical decisions are having a lot of movement. Then we are like uh, humanitarian workers or like organization, we are like wearing, observing, what is happening. And two, like Ayanna, sorry, I can't pronounce very
There you
well
have
your
it,
name.
Ayanna.
Yeah.
Ayanna, we're saying how we have to adapt our steps, our projects, our future developments to the new world that we're gonna to face. Maybe knowing months, maybe knowing 1 year or two, but by the future. That is the big
Mhm.
change that we have to live. And like John Jones is in our hands to develop and work for it.
Yeah. I mean, it's only because we haven't hit that critical point right now in the global north that we're considering it an issue. I think because the power is in the global north when the issues affecting the global south is not as considered because the finances aren't there to support it. But as we've seen through the asbestos throughout, I think Europe in an instance, there was huge clapback on that to protect the people. Additionally, when the ozone hole was an issue in the early 90s, we cut back on aerosols, which resolved the ozone hole. And then we can think of other instances, particularly in the global north, where we've kind of transitioned to renewable resources and all these issues. And of course, this isn't solving it for the global south at the moment. Um, but if we kind of put this into perspective that like issues like this have happened before and they have been resolved when they hit the critical point, it's not the point of losing hope, but the point of kind of waiting to shake the person with the money pockets out, you know? It's like it is a transition to create this change, but it has happened before, and I think that's what like I hope to remain optimistic on. And like you said, adaptation. Adaptation is local based, and it's difficult to get a collective consensus on it when the benefits aren't reaped throughout. In comparison to mitigation, where like with solar panels, for instance, that can be transferred throughout the world. And I think, additionally, like you said, how do we solve this issue? There is solutions at the moment, but they're being controlled through intellectual property rights and not allowing access and patenting in it, not to enable a financial gain for someone and deaths to another in a sense. So it's just really it's important to be mindful of the potential, but also the risks of not doing anything at the same time. I hope I answered your question to an extent.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, lady. Milamo, were you want to come in?
Yes, I think I agree with what is being discussed, and the topic is it's a very huge topic. So if I'm to streamline it to Zambia perspective, I would say, look, community engagement is another thing, but again, we will look at it in a different way of saying, from the time I was born to up to now, climate change, probably before I was born, it was a bit okay. But because of a lot of challenges that people are going through, they've brought in a lot of activities that have destroyed the environment. So we talk of now people will not afford to have gas stoves, to have these other things to use to maintain the climate to be at that level. But instead, they would rather cut trees, use charcoal for cooking, use charcoal for selling, and earn a living out of it. But going forward, like, what should we do to help them understand and make the climate be a better place for them to like have good everything that they need out of this climate? Plastics are being thrown anywhere. You try to educate them about it. Slowly things are changing because now probably they buy a plastic bag and then they'll have to keep it to use again. But when you look at the issue of the critical issue is the issue of energy. Energy is a serious problem because they will not afford to use the gas, but they would rather focus to use on the charcoal, to use on the firewood for sustaining their lives. So in this case, uh, collectively, how do we come in and help to support? Because there should be a way that we should do it in order for us to maintain our climate and be a better place for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of associates with charities in the African continent, and they've provided strategies like supporting farmers through teaching them how to compost and transitioning the use of coconut skins to kind of more biogas charcoal alternative. Additionally, repurposing plastic to as pavements, as tables for schools. And then as well, there's loads of other initiatives. I think they're turning reusable waste in Pakistan at the moment, or not plastic waste, into floatable houses that work during the flood season. So there is initiatives being brought out like throughout. And I also think when we consider what we spoke about today, which is the COPs and stuff, COPs gives us the opportunity to have everyone around the globe contribute. But at present, it's prioritizing the developed interests, and it wants to focus on who has the money and it's not willing to share. And then, as well as we see this growth in global warming, we see those people who hold the power to support greening initiatives are then getting richer, but then holding that against people in a sense. So it's just kind of considering what initiatives we have out right now, which don't focus on the use of AI, although AI can be hugely beneficial, particularly in the agricultural industry at the moment. It's being used to monitor, to identify, to kind of streamline agriculture. But like I said earlier, property rights, is that going to be transferred onto the developing nations? So I think back to your question on how we support kind of communities who can't necessarily make this decision to choose greener alternatives. It comes down to an issue bigger than ourselves. I don't think I can tell us as a sense that we can solve it individually, but as a collective, as partnerships form, as we kind of push influence onto those with the power and with the money to through this global carbon tax, which has been backed as being able to solve this issue, it would, in a sense, resolve a lot of the difficulties we've had. Like you say, with adaptate in the global in the developing countries, you're not able to choose these green initiatives. But if we had the financing, that wouldn't be as big as an issue.
Perfectly answered.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe just in terms in an Irish context, not to get too political now, but I feel like the appetite, I think, is there within the Irish public anyway. I mean, as you've seen maybe two general elections ago, like the Green Party making big strides. Now I know that obviously didn't go too well for a finish at the moment, but I think it just does show that, especially in Ireland, like the appetite is there. It's people who do want change. People are conscious of this obviously massive issue that we're facing. And I don't know, is it I think Maeve O'Callaghan, who we had as a guest last week, made a great point that language and communication around the issue is so important. I mean, like, climate change is obviously an extremely complex issue with serious nuance. So not maybe alienating people in terminology that can get mixed up on, like, not to say to use basic language, but just use language that everyone can understand doesn't alienate people. It's like it helps that everyone get behind the cause and kind of unite everyone under one force. So I do think communication that way is huge.
Yeah, and I do think that's a huge issue in the science field in particular. I mean, if I'm being honest, I can't read anything that I'm meant to be able to understand for my master's, and I think it's a real issue within because, as I said earlier, the developed nations are excluded within the sphere because it's predominantly done through the English language. Their knowledge and their lived experiences are not considered because it doesn't transfer on to what we consider valuable information in the West. And I think, like you said, language is a crucial part. And I think, as well, with the scientific key word being uncertainty, which we're highlighting that there is a gap in the information which we can achieve, people are then skewing that wording to then for their own influence and demise of global warming in a sense. So yeah, I think the wording is so specific to have inclusion, but also to recognize that simplifying it may get rid of the key message as well. So it's kind of having that balance.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose before we get on to our final question, everyone, does anyone else have any maybe comments or questions? No. I think we've answered everything, have we?
Yeah, I think we've had some very, very good questions there, to be fair. And Ayanna, like you've handled them very well as well, because it's such a large topic. It really is. And like, like what's good here is that we're able to have the conversation from many different perspectives. Like Lady is from Colombia, there's the Zambian, and then you've got Ireland as well. And we know from our work, in various different countries as well. But like there's good personal experience here as well of what's happening. And I think that it is like it is absolutely a collective thing. I mean, 100% it's a collective, but it's about an equal world. And what does that mean? And how is that really going to look? So we've got to continue on with these. This is the only meeting around the world that brings people together like this. So there's something that have to continue, even though the results aren't always fully being met by the promises, just say, of those meetings, the results of those meetings. So it's about kind of how to live in that space and actually try, try to be okay with it, because there's massive fallout for other parts of the world by behaviors in one side of the world. That's too imbalanced. So we've got to be able to try and get there. But you've answered the question so well, like you really, really have. It's amazing. Like, and this is just such a deep topic that it can be very overwhelming, but it's also really important to talk about it. And actually, COPS is a big place where there's all representatives. I don't know a single representative that's gone to any of those meetings, not one. So they're not representing me, but they represent my country, So, and I'm sure everybody in this room feels the same way, but unless you, Ayanna, actually know somebody who's gone to one of the meetings. But like,
my course actually have, so can brag about that part.
So you can brag about that, and you can actually give them a message, maybe say, can you say this for me? But like, it's how do we get to that space where we have good representation, where everybody's voice is being heard, where people can understand the language and understand the big issue, the point of the whole thing. It's like the earth is always going to renew herself, no matter what, has historically always. A human life is at most going to be 100 years. So we're such a short span in this much bigger picture. So like, it's not just talking about small things here. This is like, it's 100% the greater good, and how we work towards that together and what we're all actually doing about that. But I do think I've really, really enjoyed the actual conversation here. Like, it's great. It's like, it's good to be awake to it. It's important to talk about difficult things. And sometimes we find that hard to do because we all want to smile at each other and, and like be happily agreeable to things. But like sometimes we do have to talk about the difficult stuff. These fireside chats were, and the collective in the past and the solidarities in the past, they have always tried to address those issues. So I suppose like that's what we're trying to do here, is bring like groups of people together who want to talk about it and want to hear, what other people have to say. And what you've had to say tonight and in your presentation and in answering your questions has been really, really great. It's been absolutely wonderful to listen to you. It really has. Yeah. Thank you. Bren, you're...
Yeah, so maybe just quickly, Anna, we'll just give you one last quick question before you go. I think we had given our guest last week a very similar question. So what gives you hope in the climate movement at the moment?
I think being around my peers at the moment. I mean, we're all highly educated, privileged people to be kind of researching climate change and how it affects who and how we can make a difference, and how we can kind of navigate this fear for the better. And then it also explain scientific research and then communicate that to others. So I think my positionality and my peers' positionality gives me hope for the future. As well, also just being outside, I think greenery and earth is still around us. This isn't an issue it's not non-existent at the minute. It's just diminishing to an extent. And I think just going outside and reconnecting makes you realize that like the beauty is still there and it hasn't been vanished over the last 10 years, I think Jack has a question.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I just have a bit of a question just about I'm not sure if it was touched on earlier on, but about I suppose the context of maybe Europe and South America with the recent Mercosur deal that had been brought into cabinet and brought into Parliament. And is there anything to be said about like discussing how that has huge ramifications in terms of the destruction of the rainforest, you could say, for the industrial farms in Southern America, and then the equivalent of shipping it over here and vice versa, where I think it's tech that's going back to there or cars or something. So is there anything that we could discuss? I understand we're kind of wrapping things up, so I don't want to get stuck into something else.
There's just to land you a big question right at the end.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I was doing so well.
You nearly got away, Ayanna.
Yeah, I think in general, like everything's fueled by money and everything's fueled by what can you get out of it, and it's not necessarily thinking of the environmental repercussions and only the monetary response. So I think from that extent, now bear in mind I'm in the UK at the moment, so I haven't necessarily seen the Irish news. But the issue of trying to control and buy off the Amazon has been happening for decades in a sense. And we finally saw in 23 that the Amazon, the world's lungs, had turned from a sink which absorbed carbon to a source. The first time, I think in was it 2003 or something, that it didn't intake as much as it took out of carbon. And we can see that if we're, like you said, cutting it down for the technology transfer, what good is that having for the environment? In a sense, it might be benefiting one man's pocket, but I think that's the extent.
That's a good answer, Ayanna. Good woman.
You did well there. You did well.
Yeah,
I didn't want to catch you out or anything.
He probably was trying to catch you out. No, he wasn't. Recording. Delete.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is a good question. Brendan, are you anything?
Yeah, I think we're good. So we'll wrap things up. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us for our second Fireside Chat. Huge thanks to Ayanna for taking time out of her studies this evening to join us. So big thank you to her. I suppose if there's anyone new in the call who's new to Serve, you can check us out at serve.ie. Get lots of great information on our monthly newsletter, all about our work, what's happening internationally, what's happening locally. And yeah, I think that's about it. So on behalf of all of us at Serve, I want to just thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again, hopefully in the future for a similar kind of chat.
Yeah. So thank you so much,
for having
Ayanna.
me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.